yeah, that's just the online question. 250, 300 online. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session prior to lunch. Fantastic to see such a good crowd here on the second day. Thank you very much again for joining this London conference. Our delayed centenary London conference, no less, but all the more appropriate, I think, therefore, that I have Kevin Rudd with me here, because Kevin, you were part of the first London conference we did in Lancaster House on that very narrow stage, which I think we saw a little bit of film on for those of you here last night.
You mean not the original one in 1922?
No, there was no London conference then. There might have been a different type of one, but not a London one. So we have an opportunity here, it's just one of our In Conversation half-hour sessions, to talk about a very small topic of US-China relations, managing strategic competition. And the subtitle will become clear to you all, obviously, in a minute. But I'm absolutely thrilled to have Kevin Rudd with us, not least for all of the great things he's done in his life. Currently, as I think all of you know, president of the Asia Society in New York, position he took up about a year and a half ago now, January 2021. And since January 2015, he had been the president of the Asia Society's Policy Institute. So now combining both those roles here, and it tells you something a bit more about how the Asia Society has got into the policy space. Obviously, Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 10, then Foreign Minister of Australia. But a very distinguished record. It's long, it's in your bios. I'm not going to say more than that, except that he describes himself as a proficient Mandarin speaker. That means, yeah, he speaks it very well, which is sort of Australian understatement, though I'm not sure if that thing goes together, does it?
Essentially, it goes with the amount of booze that you've had. If you've drunk a lot, my Chinese improves.
It gets really good.
Yes.
So, Kevin has been long known as, and really it's quite a remarkable sort of Renaissance thing to do, to have had the political career he's had, but has also been one of the most astute analysts and watchers of China. In fact, I'm saying Henry Kissinger said, one of the most thoughtful analysts on China's development. So high praise from the main China watcher himself. And brilliantly timed, in fact, so brilliantly timed that you will have the opportunity to get, I think, signed copies of this book after this session. I'm going to say it now in case we run late on time and I forget to say it at the end. But The Avoidable War, which is Kevin's new book, incredibly well timed, how to avoid, or the dangers of catastrophic conflict between the US and China, or the US and Xi Jinping's China, I notice you've put here, and we'll get to that in a minute. But if you have the time, I think I've actually got the Chatham House library copy here. So this is already in the Chatham House library, just so you can see. But thank you, Patrick, for bringing a copy over, letting me show it around. But in any case, if you want to get copies later on, we will be able to do that. So I wanted to put that there and say, Kevin, thanks very much for being with us. We've got very limited time. I do want to be able to take some questions from folks here as well. But I think we should probably do a bit of a scene setter here, which is to let you just describe a little bit about the setup for the book. I think what people here would be most interested to talk about is what's going to happen next and what do we do. But the book does take some time to go into how do we get here, and what you've described as Xi Jinping's 10 concentric circles. So maybe you could just give that set up. I'm sure you've got it down to a tight line, and then we can ask some questions about what next.
No, Robin, I've been in politics. We never get things down to a tight line.
You've been out for long enough.
Thank you for having me here at the London conference, and well done for taking a vision and turn it into reality. And well done on your 15 years. It's been an extraordinary achievement. Without disparaging anyone in the past in Chatham House, you've taken it to the centre stage of the global foreign policy discourse. And that's in large part because of you, my friend. So well done. The book, 60-second elevator pitch, because I'm now into retail. I'm selling my book. Out of politics, I'm into retail. So it's basically this. How the hell did we get here, where this relationship, which was always rocky and occasionally well, always bumpy, occasionally rocky, but now in a state which is disturbing to many of us. How did this come about? That's the first part of the book, and it's retracing the recent history of the US-China relationship, just to place this into a proper context. Secondly, because I find the thing I'm asked most by heads of government around the world is, what does Xi Jinping want and what does he think? The large part of the middle of the book is my attempt to explain Xi Jinping's worldview in what I describe as 10 concentric circles of interest, starting with, I want to be in power forever, and then moving out from that in his own Maslow hierarchy of needs. And then the third part, which is the policy substance part, is given the nature of this strategic competition which is now on, however people choose to describe it, that's the reality of what's now unfolding. And the object of the competition is who does become the dominant military, economic and technological power, not just in the region, but by mid-century in the world. That's the nature of the competition. Therefore, do we have unmanaged strategic competition, which is where we are now, which is full of push and shove, no guardrails, no nothing, no rules of the road, which I find increasingly worrisome because of what history tells us, or, as I recommend in the book, a joint strategic framework called managed strategic competition, which is entirely realist. I'm not into kumbaya hand-holding. I'm not from that tradition of the Australian Labor Party. It's a deeply realist text, which is how can you fashion de minimis rules of the road, guardrails, which manage this competition in non-lethal manner for the duration of the decade ahead, which is what I call the decade of living dangerously. That is kind of the guts of the book.
And one of the things I wanted to take advantage of you being here on is to kind of turn the table a little bit on you, because as you said, the book ends up focusing on what the US and China should do. Obviously, you lay out your perspectives there of what you think Xi wants, as you said, with that fundamental driving purpose at the middle. But could I ask you what you think the China threat is? And I'm going to use that word deliberately because that's what's driving, obviously, your argument why we need managed strategic competition, because there is a perception of threat on both sides. But rather than you interpreting for us, as you do very well now, because you have 7 years based in the US perception, what do you, former Prime Minister, former Foreign Minister and Senior Advisor to Chatham House, what do you see as the main worries about China? What do you see it as a threat, for that matter, a strategic threat? And if you do, why?
I never use the term strategic threat because it's such a loaded term. I do see it as a fundamental challenge to the to the status quo. That's what it is. Xi Jinping is not a status quo politician. He wants to change the world. He sees himself as a man of history. How does he wish to do that? Probably in 2 or 3 quite specific ways. Domestically, which we may think is of no relevance here, he's seeking to develop a new style of Marxism-Leninism within the country, which is long-term politically sustainable, without suffering, as he would see it, the risks of Gorbachev's glasnost and what it unleashes domestically. Hence why we've seen Xi Jinping push the centre of gravity of Chinese politics to the left, more ideological control, the economy to the left, a greater role for state-owned enterprises, but interestingly, nationalism to the right, and a more assertive foreign and security policy. So he is not a status quo type domestically, nor is he one regionally. Regionally, the Xi Jinping challenge is this: he wishes to change the status quo. We can come back to Taiwan, but that, of course, is the principal case study here, because it's unfinished business of the 1949 revolution. And from Xi Jinping's perspective, he wants to be up there with Mao Zedong in the Chinese Communist Party Marxist-Leninist pantheon of having completed what Mao himself even was unable to complete back at the end of the Civil War. But the maritime claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea are no small beer concerns up the side. These are real. And the aspiration in terms of the South China Sea, when you look at it in its fundamental international legal reality, is to turn it into a Chinese lake, where if we were to seek passage through the lake, we would need to seek permissions in order to do so, as opposed to it being as a classic of navigation. East China Sea is both maritime and terrestrial, given Senkaku Diaoyudao. Korean Peninsula, we can come back to that if you like, but the other one is he seeks to change the status quo with India. And if you speak to our Indian colleagues, they are quite clear about the fact that the operational strategy of China under Xi Jinping is to change the reality on the ground by bit, push the border further and further in the direction of China's historical claim. So these are all non-status quo propositions. And the final one is what we call the international rules-based order, what the Chinese call the international system, where China now seeks to change the norms and to some extent the institutions of the system we're familiar with in the post-45 period. If you want one classic case study, it may seem obvious, but the extent to which Chinese diplomacy is now in Geneva and in New York and in other institutions seeking to strip out as many human rights clauses as possible from resolutions of the General Assembly, resolutions of the Security Council, the normative statements coming out of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, etc. Yep. In other words, to change the normative basis of what we took on in 45 with the San Francisco Conference, and in particular rewrite the Universal Declaration of 1948 on human rights, but not just there, through its personnel appointments to the institutions, through creating new institutions altogether, China, what I've described as world plus China institutions, to incrementally, but not in a grand declaratory fashion, change the nature of the system into one which is more conducive and supportive of Chinese national interests and values. Right. So apart from all that, nothing's changing.
But therefore, do we take from that that this is a winnable threat? In other words, so would you, as you look around the world, do you find their model appealing? Is this desire, let's say, to strip out the human rights norms and so on, one that's accruing support? Does it look to you as if China could, the reason it's a fundamental challenge, is that it actually is providing a pole around which others could gather? Because it's really just China trying to do what China does. Maybe it's manageable in a particular way. But if China is drawing in adherents, drawing in supporters, amongst other parts of the world, then that changes the nature of the risk. What's your reading of that right now, Kevin? Because obviously there's a lot of opposition coming up on the other side, but what's your feeling more broadly?
The Chinese calculus about, let's call it the future distribution of global power, which as realists themselves underpins the nature of the future international system, is their primary confidence lies in the self-immolation by the democratic world, right. Starting with the American democracy, the dysfunctionality here in Europe, the Chinese celebrated like the Russians over Brexit. They thought it's one of the dumbest things that could have been done. I tend to agree with them. I'm sorry if I've offended people. Because they saw that as weakening Europe and weakening Britain. And when they look at more fundamentally what they see as the dysfunctionality of our democracies and the fact that so much of political time and attention, whether it's in Number 10 or the White House or Canberra or wherever, is spent in the day-to-day business of just political survival in our democracies. Draghi's challenges this week in Rome, Macron not achieving a majority in the Assemblée Nationale, and so there, when they use the term 东升西降, rise of the East, decline of the West, this is not just a throwaway line. It's actually the product of quite focused analysis by their deepest Marxist-Leninist think tanks of what they see as the structural dysfunction of the democratic world, for which there is a reasonable evidence base. Yep. The reason I say that is that that is much more pronounced than is their view that their system is working perfectly and is achieving, winning friends and influencing people in the tradition of Dale Carnegie around the world. Now, it may have been that they reached peak appeal at the time when what they did on the pandemic seemed to be so fine and dandy. But since it's less fine and dandy in the last year or so, and since the Chinese move to the left on the economy has resulted in, frankly, plummeting economic growth rates, as the Chinese private sector has gone on to a private investment strike, effectively, in the last couple of years. Through the move to the left, less room for the tech platforms, less room for the property sector, less room for the private sector. That the whole idea that it was this singularly appealing model it may have reached its own peak. I think that's a second factor. And I think there's a third one which the analytical community needs to get some consensus on. If Xi Jinping's current centre of gravity on the economy and politics and the political economy holds beyond the 20th Party Congress and for the next 5 or 10 years, and if the consequence of that is that China's growth rate now slows measurably from historical norms, not just the classic 10%, no longer the 6%, no longer the 5.5 projected this year, but bumping along the bottom at 2 to 3 because the Jack Ma's of this world are no longer investing as much in the future because they're less confident. Here is the big analytical challenge, both for the Chinese and for the rest of us to wrap our minds around. Where does that land China in the ultimate geoeconomic race against the United States? And the early literature emerging is that, given the population advantage, of course, which China has, but aging population, population peaking, workforce already peaked in 2014, problems of demography, productivity bumping along the bottom at 1%, very bad for an emerging economy. Do we only end up with a China which is maybe 10 or 20% bigger than the American economy? Or maybe even 5 or 10% smaller if America manages to rebound. This becomes a profound question in the way in which we look at the next 20 to 30 years. Because if our assumptions for the last 20 to 30 years, which was we have a semi-linear Chinese growth projection, now is fundamentally changed by the alterations to domestic politics and political and economic settings to underpin the survival of the regime. In other words, to prevent a repeat of Gorbachev, keep the middle class under control, and constrain the private sector to the extent necessary, you end up killing the goose that laid the golden egg. And you end up with, frankly, a much less decisive aggregate global economic outcome in the order of, say, the 2030s, which is where I think the analysis now goes.
And then, in a way, managed strategic competition potentially becomes something that the Americans could have the time to develop, because I think that's one of your points in the book, is that a lot of Americans feel that time is not on their side and therefore act now. Now, time is not on our side either, and we've got 10 minutes or so to go. So I think rather than me prattling on with lots of questions, I want to get, all these hands are going up, and I get a few hands. I'm going to take 1, 2, 3, as I've seen the 3 go up. Why don't we do that first? Yep, please, microphone all the way over there.
Mimi Ajibade, Chatham House. Thank you very much for that, Kevin. I wanted to ask you, would you agree with me that one of the ways that Xi Jinping is trying to control the private sector was the recent shutdown of Shanghai for 7 weeks? Because everyone, well, as far as I know as a sinologist, Shanghai has always been free. And that has changed the mindset, because if you can shut down Shanghai, then no other city in China is safe. What do you think?
I think my view on that, and I'll be very brief because we've got questions and I'll try and cut to the chase on each of these. No is my answer. She's shifted to the left on economic policy really since the 19th Party Congress in September, October, November of 2017, has been in multiple areas. It's been not just in the common prosperity agenda that we've often spoken about, but the rehabilitation of the state-owned enterprise sector, the use of the anti-monopoly laws against the private sector, the tech platforms in particular, institution of party committees across the board within private sector firms, the so-called new mixed economy model, whereby if you're an effective private firm, have I got a state asset which you will now buy, lucky guy, or you're doing really well, here's a state asset that might want to invest in your private firm. These, I think, are the slowdown factors for the private sector. If Xi Jinping could have avoided shutdown, he would have done so coming out of COVID. And the reason for the COVID shutdowns is the leader can never be wrong. If the leader pronounced there shall be zero COVID in China, I am the leader, therefore there will be no COVID, and therefore we'll shut down to the extent necessary. So I think he would have preferred that not to have been the case. But the shifts to the left on the economy, in fact, predated that.
Okay, great. Here, just wait for the microphones coming over to you. Go for it.
Thank you, Kevin. Lee Solomon's UK Cabinet Office. In our dealings with Washington, what can US traditional partners do to most help or hinder the managed strategic competition you are seeking? Thanks.
I think, the reason for doing this little book is to try and be helpful in the US body politic, but also I've sent copies to the Chinese system as well. It's now going into Chinese language. So far, to my great surprise, the notion of managed strategic competition hasn't been rejected out of hand in either capital. I'm quite surprised by that. The book is quite critical of Xi Jinping, but frankly, there's a fair bit in there which is critical of the United States as well. What I sense right now is that there is an appetite both in Beijing and Washington for a re-stabilization of this relationship because neither of them actually want or are prepared for crisis, conflict and war in this current decade. But they are deeply mindful of the possibility of this occurring by accident. Therefore, my argument is to prevent that from occurring and learning some of the lessons from the period of the Cold War against the Soviet Union, what they do need is a form of joint strategic framework or narrative to manage the competition. Hence the three elements to the equation outlined in the book. So what can we best do is the core part of your question. With still being supporters of the United States, allied of the United States, and robust on all the questions which unite democracies around the world, it, I think, is to argue intelligently both in Washington and in Beijing, this relationship needs to be re-stabilized through a framework which can produce strategic stability at the most elemental level for the decade ahead. Whether it's the precise formula that folks like myself have put forward is a separate matter. I also think that we may be beginning to knock on a reasonably open or opening door. If I look carefully at, for example, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor's language in Luxembourg coming out of the meeting with Yang Jiechi, just 10 days or so ago. For the first time I saw language emerge called managed competition, the need for guardrails. So, and my own engagement with the Chinese think tanks and those associated with the security apparatus in China, to me suggests they are actively looking for some such stabilizing mechanism as well. But to conclude, stabilization does not equal normalization. Yeah. But it does take us further away from the precipice of crisis, escalation, conflict and war.
Just to piggyback quickly, because I think the sub-question also is what does Britain do? What do allies do? Do allies then just sit back and say, look, it looks like the US and China are going to work it out, but I'm speaking as a Brit now, passengers in a way in this competition. Does one have to be the loyal followers of the United States? Does one, what's the advice to Australia? What's the advice to Britain at this particular moment?
Well, I know it's an unfashionable view, but as a former head of government, I try not to provide public advice to government of the day, because life's difficult when you're running a government. It really is. That's principle number one. But principle number two is what I was just saying before, is saying both to our American friends and our Chinese friends, stabilizing this relationship by a common set of principles is a very useful thing for third countries and the rest of the world right now, is no bad thing. That, I think, of itself is additive to the current discussion. But secondly, it is not to assume a posture of equidistance. If we're allies of the United States, I hate to be blunt about this, then we are allies of the United States. And therefore, on core questions of security, we will remain in that posture. But that's not inconsistent with saying, will you two please find a stabilising framework so we don't end up with a latter-day repeat of the most monstrous failure of diplomacy and managed strategic competition, which was Sarajevo in 1914. One incident, an entirely avoidable war, nobody wanted it, and then the world changed and 60 million people were dead.
Mm-hmm. Right, the other question I saw at the beginning was over there. I'll come one at the front here, one there. Yeah, I'm going to try and gather as many as I can, but we're going to run out of time. But I guess, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. It's good.
Thank you very much. My name is Arthur Corvin-Powells. I'm a founder of Project Ukraine. So China is looking at Ukraine right now. The West did nothing in 2008. I keep stressing that point. You know, we should have sent those sanctions a while back and actually stopped it, right? And we keep actually buying oil and gas that Russia belches out after it, you know, eats the children of Ukraine. So I actually think $400 rather than $40 billion should be sent. We need to be very strong, crush Russia completely. And then, if it's possible, my question vis-a-vis China is it possible to disentangle the economy so we can stop paying for the genocide of Uyghurs as well? That would be nice, even though very, very difficult. What do we do about that? Thank you.
Well, there are two sets of questions there. On Uyghurs, I'll come back to that. Let me go to the Ukraine question first, which you legitimately ask. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the most monstrous violation of international law most of us have seen in decades, violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. So no one who is a serious scholar of international relations could argue against that reality. Secondly, the same violation occurred in 2014 when the sovereign territory of Ukraine was violated by a Russian invasion then, when Crimea was forcibly annexed by armed force. Thirdly, the reality is that I'm no Russia expert, I'm a China specialist. But because I know nothing about Russia, I went to Russia and spent several weeks there in 2014 to try and wrap my head around the Russian strategic view of their long-term China relationship. What I find fascinating is contrasting the Russian views I got from their system then to where Russian views on China now lie on the eve of their invasion of Ukraine this February. In 2014, Russia had a very distant view of their relationship with Beijing. They did not see themselves as in strategic condominium with the Chinese. They saw the Chinese as possibly a medium-term security threat. They saw the Chinese as representing a populational threat in the Russian Far East. They saw a range of difficulties, quite apart from some of the racist sentiment in the Russian Duma towards China at the time. And I spoke with all these folks. I'm not inventing the reality. Roll the clock on 8 years. The sentiment I now deduce in Russia prior to this invasion occurring was that it had gone from there to here in terms of pro-Chinese sentiment, because after the imposition of limited sanctions after 2014, the Russian system concluded incrementally they had one place to go, and that was China. And China happily accommodated that over time. And if you look at the changing temperature of their joint declarations of the Russia-China relationship and all the Xi Jinping-Putin bilaterals after 2014, leading to the one which proclaimed in early February this year, 4th of February, that this is now a relationship, quote, without limits. That is the product of Russia concluding it had nowhere else to go. So the question you ask is, what now do we do? I don't think Russia's course can be changed, other than what the brave people of the Ukraine, led by President Zelensky, are now doing on the battlefield. That's the core political reality which both Beijing and Moscow fully comprehend. The question for all of us is, once this current conflict or war is frozen, which is what Vladimir Putin now seeks to do through his consolidation of the military position in the Donbass, what do we in the international community then do in response to both Beijing and Moscow? My judgment is, for what it's worth, is that the Chinese state is deeply wedded to its relationship now with Russia. There are huge Chinese advantages to that relationship. Geopolitically, frees them to concentrate all their resources against not against Russia, but against the United States. Commodity imports, both energy and food. On top of that, Russia is always a useful tertiary theatre distraction from for the Americans, which helps the Chinese in their primary strategic engagement against the United States. Therefore, the likelihood of movement on China's part is limited, but it does exist. And where it exists right now is, I think, the deep anxiety in Beijing over Russia's policy on the matters discussed in the immediate previous session, which is Russia blocking Ukrainian food exports to the rest of the world. That, I believe, is of direct concern to the Chinese authorities. It is on issues such as that the fault lines can begin to be opened up, possibly, but these would be fault lines at the margin rather than at the centre of the Russia-China relationship.
Right, we're over time. I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you answer them as you go along. I'm going to jot them down here. I've got a pen. I've got a spare one if you want.
Oh, good.
But the question is written in your paper. So exactly. Somebody will provide a bit of paper. Give us a bit of paper if you can as well.
Thank you very much.
Who's got a note? There we go. Sophie, thank you.
Sorry about that. I came monstrously unprepared.
There you go. I've got a book you can rest on as well.
Thank you.
Right, we're going to get them all down here because I've got Jennifer, Tim, Creon, and there was one other hand that was in the group there. I'll go to Susan. Yeah, sorry. Well, I thought I only saw 3 and one more. So that's too many. Now you're too slow. Right, please.
Thank you so much. Jennifer Lind from Chatham House and Dartmouth College. I wanted to ask about the avoidability of something else, which is the evolution of the world into rival and separate spheres, economically, in the security sense, science and technology, internet, and so on. Is the best that we can hope for is a Cold War, or can we avoid that as well?
Good.
Okay. Yep, and then Tim, yep, you're next. So one of our member of our board, another member.
Tim Wellesley, King's College and Chatham House Council. Nice, easy one for me. What's your view on strategic ambiguity and Biden's recent comments on Taiwan?
Good.
Creon, colleague from Chatham House.
Yeah, Corinne Butler from Chatham House. I think it's the same question. What does the US do to fit Taiwan into a stabilizing framework?
I've got 2 minutes. What's that? I don't know what that means. Right, and then Susan over there. I see the flag, but I don't.
How does Western pressure on human rights and the defense of the multilateral system from the attack on its normative foundations fit into the paradigm of strategic stabilization?
Point of information, you didn't actually answer the Uyghur question. You said you were going to
I'll come back to that now under human rights. Yeah.
Right. I think, as it is, we were meant to finish at 12:45. It's 12:56. We're getting to 1 o'clock, so I've got to close it there. Go ahead. Well, go on. Well, I've got to close it. Go.
Go?
Yep.
Right. Thank you. Let me start with the easy one on strategic ambiguity in Taiwan. And I'll finish with Uyghurs, another easy one. And most points in between. Biden, as you know, has departed from the script on 3 occasions. I think the reason Biden has done that, including his most recent departure from the script, is not an accident. I think it's deliberate, and it's because he's speaking into a particular audience. And that audience is a Taiwanese audience. And that Taiwanese audience has been told for the last 3 months that by the Chinese propaganda apparatus that the United States is strategically unreliable. And the evidence for that proposition in the Chinese propaganda has been this, that no ground troops were committed by the United States in the defense of Ukraine, just as no ground troops will be committed by the United States for the defense of Taiwan. So, my dear Taiwanese compatriots, get used to the fact that you're going to be on your own. And by the way, look at the geography. They might be able to resupply Ukraine across land borders from NATO allies. But last time we Chinese looked at the map, you're surrounded by water, and we'll be controlling the water. I think where the ambiguity, the substantive ambiguity of the American position legitimately now lies is what form of intervention the United States would take. And that's entirely contingent, frankly, on this whole list of scenarios. So I think where the ambiguity lies is how they respond under given military scenarios. We always assume that it's going to be the million-man swim across the Taiwan Straits. well, no. There's salami slicing of Taiwan. What if the Chinese tomorrow elected to take Jinmen and Mazu off the coast to demonstrate American and Taiwanese incapacity to defend, quote, sovereign Taiwanese territory? What happens if it's a cyber attack on Taiwan's essential economic or political infrastructure? What if it's a maritime blockade imposed by the Chinese in part or in whole around the island? So therefore, the ambiguity lies in the nature and the form of the American response. On the question of what can US policy do to support a coherent strategy on Taiwan longer term, I would simply say not committing technical fouls would be useful. And by technical fouls, I mean what people in this room will be familiar with: fast and loose language around Taiwan as a sovereign state. And that is, when you start to play fast and loose with those sort of formulations, where you start to contemplate the normality of serving cabinet officials rolling in and out of Taipei, when you start to increasingly treat Taiwan as a sovereign state in the international community. My knowledge of the Chinese system, the Chinese Communist Party, the internal ideological discourse, is that you then begin to cross matters of deep religion within the Chinese system, and you're more likely than not to trigger a response which the Chinese may themselves conclude would, in other circumstances, not be geopolitically desirable, but for which they feel politically there is no alternative in maintaining the integrity of their own internal ideological worldview on Taiwan. So that sort of stuff, which is less of a problem under the Democrats, more of a problem under Pompeo and that whole worldview in terms of, let's call it the neo-Trumpian Republican Party. That, I think, is a series of technical fouls which we need to be acutely conscious of. It's not just high theology, it becomes rapid and immediate geopolitics. Thirdly, on the question of separate spheres, and are we ending up in Cold War 2.0 de facto, if not de jure? I think it's too early to call that. A lot of people, fast and loose, use the term, we're now into a second Cold War. No, we're not. Think of our terms. What was the first Cold War like? Mutually assured destruction, large strategic rocket forces ready to take each other out, zero economic engagement between the Soviet Union and the United States, multiple proxy wars, physical and hard, in the third world. None of these are characteristic of the current US-China relationship. It could go that way, but the real debate in Washington and Beijing at the moment is the degree of economic decoupling, not the quantum of economic decoupling. And at present, it's focused on microprocessors, semiconductors, and artificial intelligence, and it's also focused on elements of finance. That's where the real debate lies. So I think we're doing a disservice to the reality of what unfolds if we simply say we're now in a second Cold War. That's fast, loose, and inaccurate political journalism as opposed to describing the complex reality of the degree of continuing enmeshment. And finally, on human rights and the question of the Uyghurs, where does human rights fit? Someone up the back, I think, asked that question. I believe human rights is axiomatic to the framework that I've just described. The framework I've described in managed strategic competition just has three elements. That is, in 5 core strategic red line areas, Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, Korean Peninsula, cyber and space, that the current system of push and shove and find equilibrium by accident is now too dangerous. Too dangerous. Because there's too much metal flying around these theatres right now. And if you have a plane go down tomorrow, it's a tinderbox, and escalation becomes much more probable. That's why I recommend a frank articulation of strategic red lines by each side to the other, even if they disagree with each other. Because at present, we're poking in the dark, and that is becoming increasingly dangerous. The interception by the PLA Air Force just 2 weeks ago of the Royal Australian Air Force reconnaissance aircraft, a P-8, the release of chaff by the intercepting jet into the engines of the Australian jet, almost causing the downing of the aircraft. If you know the text of the ANZUS Treaty between Australia and the United States, you have just triggered the ANZUS Treaty, which says an attack on the armed forces of either of the contracting parties in the Pacific area shall cause the contracting parties to consult to meet the common danger. That's what it says. So that's why we seek to walk back from that. But second, and to return to the human rights point, it's this. In non-lethal strategic competition, as I said, the rest of foreign policy, security policy, economic policy, trade, investment, technology, talent, and ideas. And this should be a full contest between the Chinese ideational framework, which would underpin their alternative international system, and those which we associate with the liberal international order presided over by the United States since 1945. And as I say in the book, may the best system win. I have a sense of which system may prevail there, simply because freedom is ultimately irrepressible. My response also to our friend from the Ukraine. But there shall be a contest, and part of the ground zero of that conflict now is in the Human Rights Council in Geneva on the resolutions I just referred to before. And the further ground zero of that, and to conclude on the Uyghur point, is this. When Michelle Bachelet was sent on her recent mission on behalf of the Human Rights Council as the High Commissioner for Human Rights to Xinjiang to do a report, this was a unnecessary concession to Chinese practices in Xinjiang. And that instead, in my judgment, what was warranted was a clear and clinical report which analysed carefully under the terms of international law, the Universal Declaration of 48, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant of Social and Economic Rights, the three underpinning covenants of the Human Rights Council, and where practices in Xinjiang were above the line or below the line. That sort of clinical report was what was necessary, as opposed to what was delivered. In other words, it is a core element of the second bracket of managed strategic competition. The final part, and I'll conclude on this, Robin, is still within managed strategic competition to carve out sufficient political and diplomatic space to collaborate on climate, on global financial stability, and on the next pandemic, as Helen Clark is here, given her excellent work with the WHO review, given how much we screwed up the management of the last one globally, to do better next time globally. They're the three elements of the framework. There's a modest constituency for these ideas in such a framework in Beijing and Washington. Fingers crossed, something might actually happen. In the meantime, £20 will buy you this book.
And all the
Thanks,
insights.
Robin.
Look, I'm not going to do any more. We're so over time, but I think it was a great opportunity to have you with us, Kevin, and to share the thoughts and for us to be able to dig into them.